Hello. Miniature wargames design is an ever-evolving discipline, constantly in search of out-of-the-box thinking and innovative new ideas. And some designers are pushing the envelope further than others. My guest today is Mike Hutchinson, the designer behind Gaslands, the post-apocalyptic game of vehicular mayhem, and Hobgoblin, a game of brutal old-school fantasy battles. Mike's work has earned him many plaudits and even more fans, and I think he is one of the most interesting games designers working today. He's co-authored a book on the fundamentals of games design, and whether it's for miniature games or role-playing games, he's constantly seeking out new player experiences and ways to deliver enjoyment. We talk about Mike's methods, his career, and his thoughts on the nature of gaming and games design. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with game designer Mike Hutchinson. Mike, thank you so much for joining me. I like to start these conversations by exploring a little bit about where you first started with gaming. Like, what's the beginning of your story?
Hello, Jordan. My story begins. I was thinking about this actually before we started the conversation. I tend to talk about this as like a Christmas '93 when I got the second edition box set of 40K, and there's a picture of me somewhere in a photo album, like cradling the giant orange and red and black box. But I suppose honestly, it goes back a little bit further to the fact that my dad was super into board games. I think as the youngest of three kids, he'd always been interested in playing board games and played quite a lot of board games by himself as well. And he introduced us to all kinds of like classic Waddington's Formula One and Risk and all kinds of bits and bobs. So I think my interest in gaming sort of came out of that, and the fantastic times that some of the best times with my dad and then with my dad and my brothers were around the table with a board game. And then at some point, HeroQuest entered my life, as it did for so many of us of that generation. And that was hugely influential and must have led into the Games Workshop store in Guildford, which was where my grandparents lived, where I was suddenly surrounded by all this like intense heavy metal imagery and spotty teenagers and was like, this is it, I've landed. And I can still remember that feeling, that excitement, that thrill of the imagery and all the different colorful boxes and the games and stuff. So when I look back through old White Dwarfs, like that nostalgia is so delightful, and I think it is genuinely one of the things that's driven me as a games designer into the place that I'm at now. So
Yeah. Do you remember because it was quite overwhelming as a hobby when you first get into it, especially at that age, right? Everything is new, everything is exciting. Like you say, the heavy metal imagery, the sound and fury of all of that stuff going into the stores. But do you remember what took your fancy back then? Like which armies you were excited by and interested in?
Yeah, I was like fairly early on, I developed the same habits that I have today, which is like I'm super like distractible and my attention flips from one thing to another. So as a kid, I never really collected an army of anything. I just had like a bunch of random nonsense, and I we definitely played 40K. I'm not sure we ever played 40K like using the actual rules.
Right.
I don't think it was until Necromunda that I began to like actually properly play the games and like understand what the gangs and the sort of factions did. But I think that's also because at the time, a lot of the rules were given out piecemeal, or sort of little expanded bits of the rules were given out piecemeal in White Dwarf magazine, and so like I understood like a sort of portion of Man War from reading the Man War articles, but I couldn't see the whole elephant because I didn't have that actual rule book. And I was mentioning to you earlier that I recently rediscovered the journals. So I went back and bought off eBay these secondhand copies. They look like fifth-hand copies, to be honest, of like the old Citadel journals that I had as a kid, the ones that I remember having as a kid. And I think that these even more cemented in my mind the idea that like this was a toolbox, it was a sandbox, like everything was sort of manipulable by you. And not to get too academic, but having gone back and read a lot of the like 60s era books from like Donald Featherstone and stuff, like it's so clear to me how like Rick Priestley and Jervis and Brian Ansell like were coming out of this world where every miniature gamer was themselves a game designer because there were no games to buy, and that ethos like runs through all of this like 80s and 90s published material, in my opinion, from GW, which was like I was picking up on this vibe super loudly, which is like these games are yours, you do what you like, the rules are there as a sort of framework, but like who cares, like do what you like. And I think that like that freedom meant that I never played the games properly or immediately modded them or like wrote other things, but also like that's why I create the kind of miniature agnostic sort of open toolkitty kind of games that I make now, as well. Yeah, so yeah, if anyone wants a piece of like stone cold GW nostalgia, like these are so interesting because they're written by like nerds that had just been hired that are
Mm.
like 17-year-old guys that can't spell check, and like the whole thing is, I don't know, it's like a kind of, it's like a sort of like an Instagram page before that was possible. Like it's just a bunch of weird random nonsense. It's
Well,
great.
because
So
it's an official fanzine, essentially, right?
basically, yeah.
Yeah, so you're getting this kind of rough around the edges, playing with the systems that have been sort of codified by the core games and the proper rule
Mm.
books, but that really embrace that malleability you're talking about. And
And in one of these, or a pair of these that I've got in front of me, Rick Priestley is like laying out a new set of vehicle rules that I don't think ever became official. It was like, here's some stuff we're playing around with, and there was like discussions in the subsequent issue with like letters from people who tested them out and stuff. So this idea of public beta testing of
Mm.
rules, I think is also really exciting and interesting to see. So that's something that like potentially feels kind of modern. Like I remember canonically, like the example for me is like the open beta for Malifaux second edition, which was like this really big community moment and made a lot of people feel like they kind of owned the game.
Mm.
And I took that idea into my Gaslands first edition and did like, nearly 2 years of open beta testing with about 350 people. And I think of that as quite modern, but no, there it is in 1992 or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually, just even thinking back to one of the still most loved of the sort of specialist games that were released by Games Workshop is More Time, and
Hmm.
that did literally that through White Dwarf. They did the open beta testing. They released a load of stuff over a period of time, saying this is something we're toying with in the studio, and then
So
it
here's
sort
the
of
weird thing. More time lies in my GW null period. So when
right.
I arrived back in the hobby, 10 years or 12 years after leaving for university and beer and bass playing and stuff, like everyone was talking in with, starry eyes about this more time thing, which like I think I was roughly aware of. Like I maybe like I have a set of Skaven that I built for more time, but I must have only played like one game of it, so it's right at the tail end of my journey. But like I don't have any nostalgia for more time or any relationship with that game at all, which is weird because like it's this huge star in the indie skirmish miniature like Sky.
Yeah, yeah. Well, because it's almost sort of one of Games Workshop's indie games, I
Hmm.
suppose. You could take it in that it has a certain there's definitely a that kind of indie kind of punk vibe to it in its sort
Hmm.
of development and the way it was all put together and sold. As much as it's a very polished product in many other ways.
Hmm.
Yeah, definitely, and it's retained to this day that kind of more so even that kind of like counter culture Games Workshop vibe now. It's the if you're into GW stuff, but you're not going for 40k, you're not the main line, you're the
Hmm.
on the in the sort of niche and the back streets of the hobby. But yeah, that's
So the
fascinating.
so the other thing is that at some point quite early on, so this is a folder of Mike's very old games. At some point very early on, I started getting interested in games design. And in
Hmm.
here there's a set of like role-playing games. There's like a Vampire the Masquerade game, except everyone's in like the realm of dreams. And there's a superhero game, despite the fact I don't really read that many superhero comics, so it was a bit rubbish. There's a Necromunda role-playing game, which we actually played, which was basically like a 40k, like a it was a mashup of Woof and all of the information that's in the Necromunda books.
Mm.
But there was also some war games. There was like a sort of epic scale battle game called Warfare, rather grandly. There's something that's basically a space fleet and man of war kind of collided together. It's got all these. What are they? It's got all these like um,
Wow, yeah.
all of these things that I made
That's great.
in like Publisher in 1997 or something. Yeah, here's a Doom. Here's a Ram Smiter Kraken. And this was like partly I think because when you've only got a certain amount of pocket money and armies are so expensive and miniatures are so expensive, I guess I fell into this way of just buying bits and bobs that I wanted to, but not really being able to afford to kind of buy into any system. And my distractibility meant that I was just like, I just wanted to try everything and taste
Mm.
everything, which led to me having to like fill in the blanks of where the rules were. Also, I think I was just quite arrogant as well. I was just like, well, this game's rubbish. I can definitely write a better game than this. Um,
Well, I think there's something really interesting in that, and I think it does come back to your point about that. Certainly, the early days of the wargaming world, where everybody was a designer, but I think
mm,
those limitations, like you say, not having a lot of money to buy every new game, or even just having this, the resource that most people lack these days, which is time. You have that in abundance when you're a
that's right.
kid.
Yeah, just endless summers to
Yeah, and you're
do
looking
things.
for ways to spend it. I mean, I recall with my friends, we created a Star Trek space battle game using micro machines and
Nice.
using the space tiles from Space Fleet, and
Cool.
like you do all that sort of stuff. We created a version of Risk, which we called Expansionist Risk, which started from one territory, as in you literally had one country, and
Yeah.
then you had to grow from that, and there were neutrals between everybody. So you're sort of
Nice.
growing your empire over time. Stuff like that was fantastic. We
Early
you
4X board game development there.
yeah, exactly.
Love it.
And it's very simple. And I'm sure if we look back, the rules would probably not make that much sense. But those kinds of things were just a fun way to explore the hobby in a new sort of. You're building it yourself, and you're using all these different tools that you've got, the miniatures and the models and the dice that you've been given by these other games. But there, yeah, maybe it is arrogance, and you're like, oh, we can make something even more fun than the official guys. So is that sort of where your designing career started, or did you go off somewhere else and sort of have a more traditional career, I guess, before you got into the designing space?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd gotten the wrong idea somewhere along the lines. I'd gotten the idea that this thing that I was passionate about was just like a little sort of childhood whim, and I moved on to it to play music, and then I went to university and kind of, beer and girls and playing music and stuff. And so music became like the major creative outlet. And I was never a very capable musician or songwriter, but I got a huge amount of pleasure from the like social scene of like meeting people, creating with them, playing with them, and creating imagery and I made a ton of like flyers for band events and stuff like in that was a big sort of, I don't know, like a side passion of mine. And I guess once I'd established myself with like a sensible grown up career in London, which was basically like the short version is I wanted to be a video editor. And I did that for a while, kind of unpaid at various gigs. And then I just ran out of money. So I went and worked at the BBC briefly in a technical role. Like I started as a tape monkey. I once VJ'd EastEnders live to the nation when the server copy broke. I was once sat at home in my little shared flat and there was an old Sherlock Holmes displaying in the wrong aspect ratio. So I picked up the phone to broadcast booth four and was like, sort your aspect ratio out. And then it went on the actual TV that we're watching at home. And I was like, yeah. Anyway, so yeah, a little bit of TV and then worked for iPlayer. And through iPlayer, that got me into like a London tech career.
Mm.
The fast forward is that as essentially I ended up working, getting acquired by Epic Games. And my last 3 years prior to quitting at the top of last year and doing this full time was working for Fortnite, which was super interesting.
Mm.
And an eye-opening experience, but also an incredibly exhausting one. So, yeah, I sort of spent whatever that is, like 15 years in a tech career, let's call it. And at some point in that, like I was getting quite good at a thing called product management, which is like an area of like helping software teams figure out what to make. And I started to think, oh, maybe I've got a book here. Maybe I'll write a book about sort of the toolkit that I've been assembling because I've been, working studiously to build up this toolkit. And so tried to sit down and write this book, but every time I sat down to write this book, I would just work on another miniatures game or tabletop game. And eventually I just thought, do you know what? This is the thing I should be doing. And so I started pitching Hobgoblin around, which is something that I'd written. And the most fruitful rejection I got out of many. I got one other really nice rejection, which is I got to go and hang out with the Gripping Beast guys, and we played the game with them. They didn't pick it up, but that was a fun afternoon. I got this rejection from Phil at Offspray. He was like, we've got this thing called Dragons Rampant coming out in a few months. So we've already we're sorted for a sort of miniature agnostic rank and flank fantasy game. Thanks. But what else you got? And I sent in my website, which just had little PDFs of the bits and bobs that I've been working on. And one of them was this 8-page version of Gaslands. It was, very it was like very ill developed. It was just like the beginnings of the idea, the prototype idea. And he grabbed hold of that and was like, okay, this is something that I've been thinking about doing, a sort of car wars thing that might be interesting for us. And this system looks good. Let's have a conversation about this. And that's how the Osprey relationship started. So not all rejections are futile.
Yeah, that's really interesting though. So that Hobgoblin, which obviously would come out later, and I'm sure we'll come back to, but that was the one that you were shopping around, and then Gaslands was almost like an also ran that turned into the first great.
Yeah, so in about 2013, 2014, I got excited about games design, and I wasn't sure if I was designing board games, card games, miniature games, whatever. But I've been really influenced in the past as a musician by this book called The Frustrated Songwriter's Guide to Songwriting by Nicholas Dobson, which isn't really about songwriting. It's about breaking through creative blocks. And he has this fun idea in the book where to get through creative blocks, you like find some friends and you book a day off, and you all have to wake up in the morning, drink a cup of coffee, phone each other to make sure that you're out of bed. And then you have to write and record 20 original songs from scratch in one day. And then you have to come together with pizza at the end of the day and listen to all, 80 songs that have been written. And almost all of them are total garbage. Some of them are hilariously garbage, and very occasionally like something is worthwhile. But the value of the exercise is that you just pour out all of this nonsense and you get rid of all of the like imposter syndrome and the sort of like, oh, this thing isn't good enough. And particularly it busts through this idea that if you are an artist or a creator, you are only as good as the last thing you've created, which is like a piece of nonsense that quite a lot of us will carry around at some point. And it's not true. Like, you're not only as good as the last thing you created, you've got to create 20 crappy things for every good thing that you create, and you just got to crack on making crappy things. So anyway, I took this spirit into games design, and I sort of committed to myself to design a new game every month for a year. And that was back in like 2013, and I haven't been keeping track of it, but like it's probably statistically about true that I've created a game a month since 2013.
Wow.
Most of them haven't gone anywhere, and most of them are terrible, but occasionally you get a little Gaslands prototype and it sits there on a website for a few years and then someone picks it up. So that's kind of, but with Hobgoblin, like that was like 2014 that I started to like properly playtest that, because I've been playing a lot of big games of Fantasy Battle, and Fantasy Battle doesn't really work at like 10k with 6 players, which is how we played it. So I started writing this faster play system, and then the End Times book started rolling out, and I was like, this is it. This is my moment. Just like every other games designer did. It'd be like, right, fantasy game, stepping in. And so that's why I started pitching that around in whatever it was, like early 2015, whenever the big meteor was arriving. But yeah, so hilariously, it took me between 2015 and 2023 to actually get Hobgoblin published. And that's how long it took GW to bring the old world back as well, because it was the same, almost the same month that we announced our 2 games. So that made me laugh.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Obviously, there's some
Well,
sort of.
I'm an indie designer. I can move fast. That's my advantage.
Well, I mean, so jumping back to the Gaslands then. So you've got this 8-page prototype. I mean, first of all, I suppose you mentioned Car Wars there. Were those inspirations that you took into the creation of that game, or was it just like you say, you're creating stuff week by week, month by month? It's just I'm just going to do cars. There's something.
No, I've never played Car Wars actually, and
Right.
I never played Dark Future. What I had played was Gorka Morka, but in this folder right at the back is um, a motorcycle racing game called Speed Demon. So
Hmm.
obviously we'd ended up with a bunch of orc bikes and Space Marine bikes and stuff, and so I wrote a little racing game called Speed Demon. I'm not even sure if it's ever been played, but like lurking at the back of my mind was like a death race sort of game, obviously. So we were playing, my friend and I were John Brindley were playing a bunch of X-Wing because X-Wing was, the hot thing right then. And my friend John was actually the person who said, "Do you know what would be really good would be to play this with cars?" And I was like, "Yeah, that is a good idea." And we started exchanging a few ideas. And yes, the idea was his, but I kind of took it and ran with it and got something up and running. Initially using like the little tiny trucks from Drop Zone Commander. There were these like wicked little technicals from the Resistance faction, and that looked really post-apocalyptic. Um, but yeah, once the bump up to Hot Wheels size occurred, and I was like, well, I can't just rip off the X-wing template, so I came up with a new template sort of selection of shapes. All right, instead of 45 and 90, we'll go 30-degree increments. That will be completely legally distinct.
So what happened then when you were actually, in this conversation with Osprey about it, and then wanting to turn it into something more substantial, I
Well, I mean, you got to bear in mind that I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never been published, and I had no idea what like the expectations and what the relationship would be like. So I was just excited to be talking to a publisher, and I wasn't sure what would come. Like I knew what the Offspray kind of stable looked like, and I was excited that it would be like, okay, when it can be a standalone game
guess.
in a series, in the Blue Book series, that seems cool. And I can just make, I can just make this little 64-page thing. I'm sure I can get it from 8 pages to 64 pages. Like I'm sure that'll be. So it was just there wasn't a ton of thought up front. It was more just like I'm going to have to accept to a degree the terms that they put on the table, the sort of timelines that they expect, the royalty cut they're offering, like all of these things, like the way that the IP works out. All of those things were like, okay, I don't really have any knowledge to understand whether this is a good deal or a bad deal. Um, and also, like, this will probably fail and it will probably sell 400 copies, and that will be fine because I'll have a published game, and that is awesome. Um, so yeah, that was the sort of tone of it. It was just enthusiasm and excitement to be able to get something out there,
Hmm.
and absolutely not any even inklings of the imagination it might lead to a career change as it has. It was very much just like, well, I was planning on doing a writing book side hustle. This is great. This is exactly the sort of book I want to write.
Yeah. That's an interesting point there as well that you mentioned about like there's now a page count that you need to meet. And you've been developing these games that if it's 8 pages, I'm assuming it's super simple and it's very slick and sort of, it's to the point.
Mm.
Where's the sort of balance in like, okay, well, I just need more rules because I need more pages. So how do you sort of weigh that off against overcomplication and like, losing the kind of simplistic spirit of a game?
Yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot, and it's also like my feelings on this topic are at the heart of why, perhaps foolishly, I haven't really expanded my games much. Each of them is like its own little jewel, and it is complete, and you can have the game entirely. As opposed to my buddy Joe McCulloch, who's kind of the poster child of like just like writing lots and lots of splat books for like different campaign settings and different baddies and stuff. Because he created something. He created a game system and a product line which suits his kind of creative enthusiasm, which
Hmm.
is he's ultimately like a writer and a GM for a like Dungeons and Dragons game. And so that's what Frostgrave is. It's like an opportunity for him to write cool stuff, come up with cool ideas, and like endlessly expand that sort of one system that he's now used for 4 games. Whereas I'm ultimately a games designer and I like the writing down of things because I like the craft of writing, but it's definitely second to the alchemy of creating like a set of rules that lock together to create like poof magic
Mm.
that happens in your brain and on the table. And so when it came to Gaslands, like the question was, well, what a gamer's going to expect? They're going to expect like list building and special rules. And what will be fun to kind of provide additional granularity and detail around? Okay, well, we want more weapons, but it would also be nice to have like essentially a set of like Necromunda skill trees so that like you could play games and you could get more skills. And as I was playing through that and thinking about it, I was like, well, the thing I've always hated about Necromunda and Blood Bowl is that all the skills are kind of locked and you can't have them. It's like, well, it's all this lovely stuff, and I want like, or you get the wrong one, and it's like you can't build it. So that led to this idea. Well, maybe in Gaslands, like this is just perks that you can pick and you build, and it's a list building question. So at that point, and then it's like, well, the death race is fun, but there are loads of other ways of doing this. So let's kind of put different game modes, different scenarios in. And by that point, like I was well over 64 pages. So then it was a question of like, oh, well, what are we going to have to take out? Well, there's this cool, like, sort of Fury Road narrative campaign that'll have to come out, a bunch of war rig rules that don't fit. Let's pull those out. So I don't know, like, I wanted to create the post-apocalyptic car toolkit that like could hit all the genre tropes and give you a bunch of like open gaming material that's like, well, this isn't just one exact experience. It's like a set of things that you can kind of plug together to create the kind of game that you want. But in the end, it wasn't really used like that. Like most people play Death Race most of the time, and those people that do use the perks and sponsors, which is not everyone, use it as a list building kind of optimization tool, which is cool and what it's there for. Um, but yeah, I don't know. Like I could, for example, with Gaslands, I could like endlessly release new vehicles, new factions, new perks, but it just increases the overhead of having to like understand and acquire all of the rules of the game. Whereas I think what people tend to like about Gaslands is you can get it on the table with a large group of people, and it's fairly easy to just like extract fun from it without too much hassle. And I think actually what has also happened is that because I haven't expanded Gaslands, it gets sort of considered differently to treadmill games.
Mm.
So when a game gets a lot of content and you have to keep up with the content, there's a good thing, which is the game feels fresh and it feels relevant and it feels like it's always available to you because it's new and it's constantly being updated. What seems to be true about Gaslands is that it's kind of evergreen in that people will happily play Gaslands because it exists and it's there and it hasn't been updated, and therefore there hasn't like it's not like you've missed some Gaslands and you have to catch up. Um, does that make sense? Like I feel like if I'd have been constantly
Sure.
updating it, it might have almost felt like the old rule book was more old than it in fact is.
Yeah, sure. And obviously, I suppose if you think about the game that's going to stay the same forever, presumably like chess, for instance, right? Anybody who's got a chessboard and the pieces can play. You don't even need the pieces necessarily because you can just use whatever you've got. But once you know those rules, you can play with anybody that you meet who knows those rules. And there's a sort of a simplicity and an engagement from that you can get. Whereas if you're constantly pursuing the changes and the new releases and that sort of stuff, it's a different kind of relationship that you build with the game, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that's like I think about this a lot as an indie games designer, like as an indie maker. I want to create a situation for myself where I can create things that I'm excited about and that I want and that I'm passionate to like make and put out there. I don't want to create for myself a world where I'm beholden to my own creations to keep making more of the same thing even after the point where I'm particularly passionate about it.
Hmm.
And also, like big companies with big model lines and staff and stuff, like they have to do that to keep the money churning at a certain level. I don't have to do that because I'm just me. So if I can figure out how to, make a new game that is sort of self-contained and wonderful and gets people excited, and that makes about as much money as making a Gaslands expansion, then amazing. Like that's
Hmm.
great for lots of reasons. But I can only sort of do that because of the the size of because of the fact that I'm an indie and I'm just working by myself. So it's trying to find opportunities to like take the things that are true about my situation and make them into strengths.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting because obviously there's the commercial aspect of that is exactly what you say. You're sort of trading off wanting to focus in on something that you're passionate about, which might be here's a new game, here's a new problem to solve, and a new kind of system to create and explore, versus what could potentially be a more commercially profitable venture that's expanding something that already exists, where there's already a market and people already know what they're going to get, but might not be as creatively fulfilling potentially, right? So, I
Yeah.
mean, presumably there's always going to be that kind of compromise, and you have to make different choices at different times based on the market and everything else that's going on, right?
Yes. I mean, I don't know how it's going to fold out, but like right now, I've just been following my heart, and so I didn't make a series of Gaslands expansions so much. Like I made a few things as part of the Blaster anthologies that we put out. Like I made a few things happen in there, um, but what I've actually done is spend time making Hobgoblin happen, and now spending time making Space Gits happen, and yeah.
Mm. So how did you come to? So at the time, Gaslands, you've expanded it out, you've done the deal, Osprey are publishing it. You're still doing this as a sort of side hustle, right? A part-time gig
Mm,
alongside your sort of more traditional job.
yeah.
When did that transition happen where you were like, okay, actually I'm going to make this my full-time career?
Well, so Gaslands was kind of a slow burn initially. It didn't sell a huge number of copies straight away, but it kind of built and it built and word of mouth spread. And that like curve of like how many people were coming to my website and how many people were joining the Facebook group was really exciting. But it's still like, it was 6 months until I saw the first royalty check, and the first royalty check was small. And I was like, all right, okay, this is what this is. It's like it's beer money, it's side hustle stuff. And as I got excited about the next project and kind of pitched A Billion Suns to Offspray, and that happened, like I definitely wanted to like keep making games, but it wasn't until the Blaster anthology, like that group of people came together during lockdown, and I had a lot of time during lockdown to like make games and invent new IP. And I was like sitting with all of these game makers, and people like Sean Sutter, who've like built his entire life around creating games as art and, making all the miniatures and making all the artwork and getting everything out. And, it was really inspiring, particularly like seeing how Sean Sutter works, how Ash Barker has kind of built his sort of his media empire, if you will, alongside the game design stuff. And I just thought it just began to creep in like, oh, I really would like to try and find a way to make this. Like, I'm hanging out with Joe McCulloch. He's one of the few people that's making this work full time, that's kind of publishing through Osprey and stuff. Like, surely I must be able to find a route to do this. But at the same time, I had this like really, really awesome job at Fortnite. Like I was working in like one of the most interesting kind of tech video game plays with like an incredibly interesting, you say what you like about Tim Sweeney, like he's my kind of madman, and he was really interesting guy to work for in many respects. So I thought, well, maybe this Epic thing is like maybe this is the next 10 years. Like this is well paid, it's interesting work. And it basically that job collapsed like from a burnout perspective. Like it collapsed in a pretty catastrophic way around the end of 2022, and so it became super obvious to me that I wasn't going to be able to stay at that company for kind of health and psychological reasons, and that essentially accelerated this decision that had already been sat in the back of my mind, which is at some point I am going to make a go of doing full-time games design, because I think I'm really good at the games design part. I think I'm beginning to get enough like credibility that I can land, books and stuff with publishers fairly with some fair certainty. Like I think the conditions are right for me to do this, and now the conditions are kind of wrong for me to stay in my tech career. Like this is it. I've got to do it. And so that's what I did. And it was a little bit terrifying because I was doing it kind of in a moment of occupational burnout where I wasn't my best self. I wasn't able really to work very hard. So like the experiment began with like an exhausted me,
Mm.
not like a fresh faced like leaping out of bed like, okay, this is it, we're going to do the thing I've waited my whole life to do, which is honestly like at the start of this year, that's kind of how I'm feeling. I'm finally feeling that way, like, yes, this is what I was born to do.
Mm.
Let's see if I can make this work and stick at it, make it sustainable. So the transition was very slow from like Gaslands in 2015 is when like that journey began. Like it took just shy of a decade to get to this point of being able to say, nah, let's do this full time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a fascinating sort of way to come into such a big change and a new sort of world. And I have some sympathy there, and some echoes of my own sort of journey
Right.
in actually
Yes.
moving into this kind of space, because it's a very different world to that kind of traditional kind of corporate culture and that very structured world of tasks and delivery. I mean,
Mm.
what's your just even from a way of working? I'm curious about what like how different it is, because I imagine there's a much more kind of emphasis on solo working and sort of taking, you're taking however much time it requires to complete a task as opposed to meeting kind of corporate deadlines in perhaps the same way. Am I right in that thinking? Is it quite a different, just the way of working is very different?
Yeah, completely. So one of the things that I found very useful and inspirational over the summer last year was I read a few books that kind of helped me build a new mindset around this. And one of them was this book by Cal Newport, who I'm a huge fan of, called Slow Productivity. And in that, he's basically saying there's a bug at the heart of like knowledge work, which is what I think you and I have always done as a career,
Mm.
which is there's no measurement for productivity. So no one can be judged on whether they're doing a good job other than whether they look busy. And this struck me like a lightning bolt. And I was like, yeah, I am really good at looking busy. Like I've built an entire like career around looking busy. I'm also really good at the things that I do, but like they are subservient to the looking busy, which is the thing that makes, me get promotions or like not get fired or whatever. And it struck me that the beginning of my journey at the first 6 months of 2023, I had been finding ways to look busy publicly. Like I'd launched the YouTube channel, I've been posting videos weekly, I've been posting all kinds of new games. And I was like, oh, wow, I'm just taking this same mindset of like, the boss is watching, look busy, make another Slack post, like quick, send another email. Um, and I'd taken that into this creative work, and I was like, shit, I think I'm doing the wrong thing here. I think I need to slow down. And so I had this really interesting conversation with a publisher, which I won't talk about too much because it still hasn't concluded. But like there was a new game idea that I was pitching, and I needed like a lot of time to think about it. And I ended up basically just focusing on that one pitch for 3 months. And I just like designed that game, iterated it, play tested it. And like that's 3 months that may go nowhere. And that would be a real shame if that didn't go anywhere. But like I thought this is going to be could be hugely important for my future success if I get it right. Let's focus. And the other thing that I read over the summer was this, it was mentioned somewhere in Cal Newport's book, was this book called Daily Rituals by Mason Curry. And Mason Curry's a journalist, and he just took he's just taken like 100 different sort of authors, artists, musicians, scientists, and he just details what they do each day, like when they get up, what time they have breakfast, like when do they work, what do they have lunch, when do they start drinking cocktails. And it was fascinating because I didn't read the whole book. I got about 80 or 60 through, and I was like starting to see the patterns of what made sense to me and what sort of felt wrong. And one big realization was a lot of writers in these examples were like they get up, they do a bunch of writing, and then after lunch they do all their letters and boring stuff. And I was like, oh wow, that's super relevant to me. Like the resonance there is that like by about 3 o'clock I'm like complete useless and I'm always in a bad mood and I need cake or whatever. So I may as well be doing boring, irritating work like responding to emails and writing, expenses or something when I'm already in an irritated mood, rather than saying to myself as I had been, like, okay, it's 8:30, I'm fully caffeinated. Let's just clear the desk of the admin work and then I can get down to the interesting creative work, which of course expands to fill whatever available time. So I suppose in answer to your question, like I've had to quite mindfully go out and seek new mindsets about the working patterns. And like I tried a few things and then they weren't working. And so I kind of went seeking for more inputs to like figure out, okay, what is it that I'm not thinking about here that's causing me to get frustrated about not getting enough work done, or not feeling like I'm getting enough done, or feeling like I'm working loads, but I'm not getting enough creative output.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's fascinating. Some really interesting ideas there. I might take some notes and and apply some of that myself. But
Honestly, Mason Curry's book is super fun because, some of them are just like, he got up at 4 in the afternoon, like drank a coffee, ate two croissants, took drugs, and then worked until 8 in the morning. And you're like, okay, this one, I'll pass on this one. Sounds good, but I'll pass.
yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I mean that's really super interesting. I mean, you do hear lots of different sort of writers' routines, and some who will approach it like I think Bernard Cornwell would say. I get up and I'm at my desk for 9, and I write until 5, and it's a desk job for him. And he would just like that's how he wrote so many books.
Yeah, and I always hear that about Nick Cave as well. Like he just
Right.
like turns up at the piano at 9 o'clock every day, and he whether he wants to or not, he's writing songs. But I think the point for me is that like other people's routines can be an inspiration and they can be a filter to figure out what's going on with you, but like no one's routine is going to work for you 100%, and there is no magic formula. It's just like what is your clock like, and what is your proclivities like, and what's else is happening around you in your life. There is no like magic formula. There's just being kind of alive to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very, very valid point, actually. The mindfulness, like you say, of even asking the question of yourself. Like,
Mm.
what is the best way I work? What is the best structure? And what should I be tackling at certain times? But it sounds like, I mean, from a productivity perspective, like you said a bit earlier, on average, you've produced maybe a game a month for a number of years. I mean, there's obviously a huge number of ideas and a huge amount of just work that you're doing. How are you sort of like where's all that coming from? How are you keeping up with that level of creativity, I suppose?
Such a weird question. Like I know that the question makes sense, but like the question doesn't make sense to me. It'd be like, so I mean the answer is like I I I choose to do games design. I choose to think about game design ideas. I choose to write little game prototypes in the spaces when I could be doing something else and I've chosen not to. So I don't, and none of these things that I'm going to say are judgmental in any way. Like I don't watch a ton of television. My reading of books is fairly light at the moment. Like I would like to be reading more fiction books than I in fact make time for. Quite often, like at 10:30 at night, we'll be in bed, my wife will be reading and I will be writing, just sketching out, scratching out little notes. And so the answer is like, whether it's impulsive or it's deliberate, like I'm just choosing to spend quite a lot of my time doing that. And
Mm,
that's how I get all of the time to do it. I don't know.
sure.
I mean, it
It
seems
does,
kind
yeah,
of,
no, it does make sense. I mean, and maybe a tangent or a sort of parallel question that actually. One thing that I've noticed across a couple of your games, at least, is that you'll sort of take everyday objects and then kind of repurpose them for game mechanics, or even in the case of Gaslands, you're using Hot Wheels or other cars to turn them into something else
mm,
for your game, whether that's playing cards or chessboard, the
mm.
actual checkerboard itself. Is that like a deliberate thing? Are you looking around and sort of casting about for, okay, maybe I can make a game of that or that or that? Or is it literally just in the moment you're kind of, oh, you know what would be perfect? This thing I saw on a shelf earlier.
Mm. I think like I'm trying to expand into role-playing games and like card and board games. But the reason that my passion is miniature gaming is that like ultimately I think that the playfulness of like having physical toys in front of us and manipulating them as adults, like it allows us to sort of put a veneer of like this is a serious strategy game with things and I'm being a grown up, but ultimately it's just toys and it's manipulating these physical objects in this playful and imaginative way. And so I'm always reaching for physically satisfying objects, if I can use that in a in a non-euphemistic way. Like rolling dice is pleasurable, moving miniatures around is pleasurable, like flicking toy cars around, as I have recently discovered in my little prototype game, Flicking Heck, is also like extremely exciting. Like the idea of like the reason that miniatures war games are so difficult to like make very short and one page is that like they have to be allowing any object to like enter the play area and be described by some kind of rules system, like some rules engine, that if I put my shoe, we know it's sort of blocking and obscuring terrain and we can't move onto it, but we can move around it. Like no other game format really has that kind of operating
Mm.
system to allow that, but it's kind of the magic that allows me to just like grab any piece of like rubbish off of my desk and just be like, right, that's a crater, it's going to halve your movement or something. um but no, I mean in most cases it will come from an interesting idea that comes out of a discussion or a piece of media that I've consumed. So for example, the chessboard idea, this idea of a chess 28 game where you take miniatures and you put them on the chessboard, we were discussing on Rule of Carnage, my game design podcast. I can't remember exactly what we were discussing, but out of the conversation floated this idea: what if chess was miniature agnostic? Which is kind of a nonsensical statement, but it was such a delightful statement. I was like, yeah, okay. What if chess is miniature agnostic? And let's just roll with that and see where we end up. Um,
That's fantastic. That is great. Yeah.
you can look up the Chess 28 manifesto. It comes with a very angry sounding manifesto. Because that appeared to me to be entirely part of the gag.
Well, I mean, you mentioned that move as well into role-playing games and sort of exploring other types of games. I take it, and you sort of mentioned, I think, a few RPG experiences. Is that something that you do a lot of? Are you a big role player, and are you sort of drawing on a lot of experience there, or is it just a new world that you're exploring now?
I think role playing was like that. So after 40K, like role playing kind of took over during my teenage years, maybe about age 15, 16. And so I started doing a lot more role playing around that part than I was playing war games, I think. So like,
Mm.
they really were both like big parts of my childhood. Because I'm a Brit, like I've never played Dungeons and Dragons. To this day, I've never played Dungeons and Dragons,
Right.
because we played Woof and we also played some other weird stuff. Like rifts and things. But I kind of grew up on Wafrup and Call of Cthulhu and reading but never playing Traveller and like Paranoia we played in whatever second edition. So yeah, role playing was a big thing when I was growing up. I don't know that we ever figured out like exactly how you're supposed to role play, but like some of my most cherished childhood moments are playing like Legend of the Five Rings, but like it's super wacky the way that we played it. And in fact, one of the things we were talking about, Dragon Meet, which is a convention that I went to a couple months ago, two of my old role playing mates from that period of time, like I haven't spoken to them for about 10 years, they came up to say hello and I was like, oh my god, and they were recounting like some stories of a Legend of the Five Rings campaign that we had played together, that was totally ridiculous. And then prior to lockdown, there was like a good 5 year period where I was playing sort of Skype based role playing because I had a friend I'd made a friend locally, but like my old school friend was still in London. I'm in Canterbury. So we would hang out and play role playing games because it was like super easy to do that. And later we discovered Tabletop Simulator, which I kind of regret because I hate Tabletop Simulator and it makes me feel kind of motion sick. Um, that's not literally true. I just really hate the act of manipulating things on Tabletop Simulator. So that group kind of ended up going more into playing card games online. So I don't do as much role playing as I used to, but
Mm.
still doing a little bit. And I don't know. I think that my tolerance for like systems in role playing has sort of evaporated. I'm playing
Mm.
more and more just like what I love is the thing that I was no good at as a kid, which is just like improvising stories. I think that's partly because as a miniatures gamer and as a tabletop like board and card gamer, I get a lot of the like hard system mastery stuff out of those areas, but
Mm.
I absolutely cannot get like improv story creation in anything like the same way. So for me, like I know this isn't true for everyone, but like for me, like the shining peak of role playing, the thing that it can do better than anything else is the thing that I want to focus on, and that's the like making stories up together.
Mm.
Um, so yeah.
How does that? I mean, that's an interesting, almost not quite a contradiction, but an interesting sort of tension, perhaps, between as a player, you love the storytelling element, that collaborative exploration, but you're a games designer by trade, so you can't necessarily just put together an RPG to sell that is go and make it up yourself, right? There has to be some sort of structure to it and kind of not necessarily mechanics, but that's typical, I suppose. So how do you sort of square that circle when it comes to RPG design?
Well, I think that the answer is probably twofold. One is, let me see if I can sort this out in my brain. One is it's really important to provide um, guidance and patterns and sort of inspiration. Like we're as role players, we're all looking for that sort of like structures. And actually, I think that probably like one of the ways that you get to very rules light structured improv, unless you come from theatre, is by consuming so many rules that they kind of melt together into like, I understand the matrix of like what this is supposed to do and like what
Mm.
the sort of percentages or what the sort of narrative beats are supposed to do. And now I don't need any one system because I'm kind of sweating all of the systems simultaneously. The other thing is that like not everyone likes to do that and not everyone can do that, and I only got to that through playing lots of other more mechanically complete systems, even within the last 5 years or something. So like I have gotten to that point by like I played some RuneQuest about 4 or 5 years ago, and like that really helped me understand like what it is that I don't want in my games versus what I do want in my
Mm.
games. And so I think that when I approach role playing as a games designer, I'm looking for very system light ways of like resolving problems, but very intentional structures, so that like the thing that I'm designing is like how can I most deliver an experience to you, not like how can I provide the most complete set of simulationist mechanics that will allow you to do whatever, but like how can I scope your experience, set your expectations, and then provide you with a set of tools that will kind of guide you to a cool experience in that regard. um, and like one of the things that I found incredibly inspirational in that journey was Graham Walmsley's Cthulhu Light, which doesn't really have any rules in it, but it's really intentional about what you can and can't do. Like the verbs are really restricted in a
Mm.
way that like um, I quite often think about the games that I write as being more like indie video games or like short stories, insofar as they are trying to do one thing in a very specific and crafted way. They are not like video game engines that are there to provide n number of experiences and sort of fit any game experience in.
Mm.
And so like where am I going with this? So like what I like about Cthulhu Dark is that it's very limited in the things that you can do. Like the verbs available to the characters are limited, so that you're focused on what it is that he thinks is important in creating that kind of experience of a horror game. Um, and so that's great, because if you want to play a different kind of horror game, you can play a different game. But if you want the like nihilistic sort of, you see a monster, you die thing, then he's provided that in this really like highly designed, even though it doesn't end up needing that many rules kind of a thing. And I find that very inspirational.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, one thing that that you were working on recently is the crawling chaos, right? Now, this sounds like a very interesting twist on role playing games, right?
I
So,
made
can
a
you talk a bit about this and the sort of the design ethos behind it?
Yeah, so this is the Crawling Chaos is my first role-playing game proper that I've like finished and made a thing. And I am actually planning to take this to Kickstarter as part of Zine Quest. I'm not sure when this video will drop, but in February, be looking on Kickstarter for the Crawling Chaos. So the Crawling Chaos is a Lovecraftian story game with one player and many GMs. And the player is playing the narrator of a weird tale, and they've got complete agency over their narrator, and they are sort of they're intended to be kind of a passive reactive character, as narrators often are in these sorts of stories. The other players play the architects of their doom, and they have a pool of points that they can spend to take specific actions. So, like the pools of points they have are things like family and ancestry, the city, liminal spaces, sleep and dreams. So they will get like a random selection of points, and then they can spend them to introduce adversaries, introduce threats, and they are essentially trying to cajole them towards a hideous and eldritch doom. And there's a tiny bit of kind of competition insofar as if you, as an architect, manage to be the person who like consummates the final eldritch doom, then you get to kind of narrate the final word of the story and add a stinger or a kind of, you know, a kind of final moment. And the narrator, who is to a degree a reactive element in the play group, they've also got like a dark secret that is their sort of dark desire that they want to consummate. And if they can die or be doomed, but, you know, actually achieve their consummate their dark desire, then they kind of, you know, can feel like there's a pyrrhic victory there. So it's a little bit gamic in that regard, and it's intended to be like zero prep, and it plays out in about 90 minutes, 2 hours, that kind of thing. But in playtesting, it's just been a really fun way of, in some cases, like leaning into the tropes and horsing about with them, and in other cases just like really trying to spook each other out.
That's great. Yeah, because it's almost like a structure then, it sounds like, to kind of create your own Lovecraftian short story, or M.R.
That's it.
James, or, you know, this kind of like a sole individual who encounters something that they shouldn't, and they're maybe a bit more curious than they should be, and then what flows from that. But that's fascinating to try and to sort of create this multiplayer, like the darkness, the Cthulhu, the chaos, whatever it might be. They're all the different aspects of it sort of working together to doom someone and against each other, as you say. I mean, what in like practical terms then, what so would the stories literally be like that kind of thing? You're going to be someone who discovers an artifact and maybe researches it and goes off
Yeah, so at the
investigating.
start of the game, the narrator like creates a character, which is quite simple. They like roll twice on a occupation table to find out like what they currently are and what they were previous until recently, and then they roll twice on the wealth table to find out like how wealthy they are now and how wealthy they were until recently. And then they get a small pool of like composure, ignorance, and vigor, which are their like three stats that are basically trying to be eroded by the actions of the architects. But then they have to leave the room, literally or metaphorically, and then the architects who roll up their like starting pools of aspect points, they then like agree roughly what the big threat is, like roughly what the source of the doom is, and there's a table if you want to, but in one of our games, like the narrators sort of the initial rolls that they made on the occupation table and his like initial description of like who he was gave us a really strong idea of like what it probably was going to be the source of the downfall. And so we like just texted each other like the single phrase Yellow King, and then we were like, okay, so that's all we need as a set of GMs to basically riff off each other. We're going to be trying to like come up with cool ideas and like build and go sideways as the narrator like describes their current situation, and then we take actions to interrupt and cajole that person forward. But the story that emerges from the session isn't known to anyone. It's just like it's, you know, it's just proper improv. It just provides a little bit more structure so that, you know, you could play a game like this purely through, you know, the players agreeing that this is the kind of thing that we could do, but having a player who's got a specific role as the narrator, who can only control the narrator and no one else can control what the narrator does, just gives you a structure a bit like, you know, a bit like indie games like, oh, what's the one about crimes going wrong? Fiasco. Like, you know, in many respects, like you could play a game of Fiasco without the Fiasco rules, but like it just helps you formulate and kind of glide along the rails towards the direction of a cool story with a cool outcome. And because in Crawling Chaos, like you can't consummate the final doom until you've like eroded the pools of the narrator enough, like there's a kind of pacing to it as well.
Yeah, so you can't just instantly be like, right, the guy goes
Yeah,
mad.
dog off, blah.
Why? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's great. So, I mean, is there more stuff in the that you're working on from an RPG perspective then? There's more like ideas to explore?
Yes, there are. I don't know when they will emerge because I've got lots of other things to work on. But yeah, like at some point in my career, like a Gaslands RPG would be completely sick. I totally want to do that. But yeah, no dates for that coming up. I've been hanging out with my buddy Gav Thorpe to drop a name, and he and I have been chatting about an RPG idea for a while. So that's another thing that is bubbling around in my brain.
That's great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've got to figure out, Jordan, how to make enough money to feed my children this year. Because I've got some games coming out through publishers, but the royalties for those take ages to
Mm.
manifest and are a little uncertain. So that's why I'm taking Crawling Chaos to Zine Quest to make a little bit of money, and that's why shortly after I'll be taking Space Gits to Kickstarter because I've got some cool publisher backed things coming from Osprey and others, but like I'm not going to make it. The savings are going to run out before I
Mm.
get to those royalty checks.
But yeah, actually, you tell us about Space Gits because that's quite an arresting title. So I want to hear more.
Okay, so I'll give you a brief background. Um, Gentle viewer, if you don't know, I wrote recently and published this year a textbook called The Fundamentals of Tabletop Miniature Games Design. This is the collected musings of me and Glenn Ford, my co-host on the Rule of Carnage podcast. We cover lots of topics in that book about designing miniature games. We got to the chapter on dice mechanics, and we were examining all the different ways that you can use dice in miniature games. And we got to the second, like the last part of that chapter is about the physical presence of the dice and like all the things that you could potentially do with the affordances of a physical object. And it started to occur to us that like the where the dice are literally in the table is almost never used.
Mm.
And so I caught onto this idea of like, okay, what if that matters? And what if like random movement is achieved by rolling dice into the play area and then you have to move towards the literal position of the dice? And maybe you have to move only as far as the dice number that's rolled. But obviously that's going to prove very, very random and incoherent. So we'll have to pick a theme that makes sense for that. So drunken orcs looting and scooting off with the loot was kind of the place that my brain immediately went. So that's what Space Gits is. It is a dexterity-based miniature skirmish game of drunk-ass orcs looting, shooting, and scooting. And it's all based around this goofy set of dexterity mechanics. So like to move, you roll 3 dice and you kind of move towards them a number of inches that they're rolled. To shoot, you roll a dice and the bullet travels from your orc to where that dice is, and if anything's in the way it gets hit. And every time you activate or take damage, you have to add another dice onto a little tower beside the model, and when you move the model, whenever the model is moved, you move it or it gets pushed in for whatever reason. The tottering tower of dice has to come with it at the same time, and if it falls over, then so does the orc.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I mean, you don't tend the sort of physical dice themselves don't always play that big a role. And I guess there is some areas to explore. I'm just thinking of obviously there was Space Fleet and a couple of GW games back in the day where you actually had the hit and miss matrix in the top of the box, and you dropped the dice in there and you would land on the hit or miss.
I nicked that idea recently. So there's another game I published recently called Rad Pirates of the Toxic Sands, which is my one box war game. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this. You take the one box of miniatures and then you stick the cards, the like ship cards, in the box, and you drop the dice into the box. And if it touches any of the locations of that ship card, then that's what gets damaged. And different ships have different sized cards, so it's easier to hit or miss.
That's fun. That's almost combining it with like a battleship kind of
yeah, it's like Man of War
element.
meets Space Fleet.
Yeah, that's great. That's really fun. I mean, I guess this is the joy of like, yeah, you can see a cool rule or a cool idea, and you can go, right, how can I riff on that? I suppose.
So there's an idea. Oh dear, I'm going to drop Cal Newport's name again. So there's a book that I read by Cal Newport about 5 or 6 years ago called "So Good They Can't Ignore You," and he's got this idea that is like the way that you get really good at something. The way that you like get a lot of freedom in the things that you can do is by getting really good at something, and getting really good at something means understanding an enormous amount of the sort of current knowledge and wisdom and possibility space, because if you understand a domain really well, you can see the sort of boundary of that domain, and therefore you can see what is the, I think he calls the adjacent possible, where it's like this thing hasn't been done, but I can see it because it's quite close to something that hasn't yet been done. So writing a textbook about this and then being able to see, well, there's fun that hasn't been explored here. I'm really excited because these game ideas that I'm explaining to you, like I feel like there's exciting novel ideas in them, and then people can catch on to them because like there's a lot of games being written without having spent an enormous amount of time thinking about the entire domain. And so they'll be being like, well, it's like Necromunda, but with this, or it's like 40k, but with alternating activations. It's like, well, that's fine, but it's very, very far from the like circumference of what the adjacent possible is. Like there's new things to be discovered. And because miniature gaming, like technically it's about 200 years old, but like really it's only about 40 or 50 years old. There's a ton of, well, that's not true. Academic override, doesn't matter, whatever. Um, because there's so little like examples of this art form, if you will. There's a ton of stuff to explore in miniature games design, and oh my god, there's so much like exciting work that will happen over the next 20 years. And I want to be making the crazier end of that because I'm working for myself, and therefore I don't have staff and shareholders and anyone to tell me that Space Gits is a terrible idea. Like, no, Space Gits is going to happen. It's going to be amazing.
That's great. I mean, just one other aspect of what you do that you alluded to earlier. I think you mentioned it just as one of the ways in which you're sort of publicly facing was your YouTube channel, and I was just curious about that as a sort of part of your broader career. I mean, what's the sort of thinking with that YouTube channel? What are you doing there?
I guess the YouTube channel for me is it so its purpose is to like continue to market myself and like my story and me as a designer and as a person that you might want to follow the work of. And I could do that in lots of ways, but like I'm quite comfortable talking off the cuff in front of a camera or in front of a notional audience. I did it for years as part of my job. I just quite enjoy it. I get a lot of energy out of it. I said, I think earlier that like initially when I moved to London, I wanted to be a video editor. So like there's still a part of me that's like genuinely delighted that I get to boot up like Adobe Premiere and start cutting video. Like I genuinely like that. So I could have been doing something more like visual on Instagram, or I could be doing something more bloggy like I used to do on my website. But yeah, just chatting in front of the camera or videoing the game design work that I'm doing, videoing little games that are in progress and stuff. That is I wouldn't say easy for me, but like it's quite natural to fit into the sort of rhythm and routine of what I'm doing. But the like purpose of it is I don't have the budget for like big splashy marketing releases of my games. What I can do is build an awareness slowly over time that something is being worked on, something is coming, and then after it gets released, like something is still fun. And so showing my process, showing my games being played, both of those are really important, but quite small scale ways of just like generating some interest and some understanding. And specifically because I can't afford big splashy marketing releases, like I'm kind of not bothering. I'm also not keeping my cards very close to the chest. So like when Space Gits arrives on Kickstarter in probably March, like it will have been available for everyone to look at and download for like at least 9 months. Like I did the first video with the how to play in June. And so I'll have got sort of a slow word of mouth growth of like awareness of that game, where like every month I leave it between, first talking about it and asking you for money is like a little bit more word of mouth that could grow. So yeah, it's like a deliberate sort of anti marketing or like anti launch splash.
Sure. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's quite a sort of a unique approach, I suppose, but one that does make sense. I mean, just where did the name Planet Smasher Games come from, by the way?
It comes from Devin Townsend. Do you know him?
I'm not familiar now.
He's a heavy metal guy. He has an album called Ziltoid the Omniscient, and the Planet
Right.
Smasher is a character in that. But the name it was chosen because I wanted something that was bombastic enough to like match my own arrogance.
Well, I think it's achieved. It's achieved for sure.
Yeah.
Well, it's been terrific to talk, Mike. I've really enjoyed this. What sort of are the key things? You mentioned a few things that are coming up. What are the key things that people can look out for from you over the next 6 months, I suppose?
Yeah, so the ways that you can help me are you can go and find a copy of Hobgoblin, Brutal Fantasy Battles, purchase that and play it. It's really excellent. You can look on Kickstarter. There are preview pages for both Space Gits and the Crawling Chaos that you can click the follow button so that you can be notified when those launch. But honestly, one of the most important sources of stability and sustainability for me is my Patreon. So patreon.com/PlanetSmasherGames. Basically, all of these prototype games that I pull out in early access, I put them up for a $5, and if you're a Patreon, you get anything that I release, you get for free. So I don't commit to give you anything per month, but my output is pretty consistent. So you definitely get something for your money.
Good stuff. Yeah, I'll put all those links down below in the description as well, so people can find that. But yeah, Mike, absolutely fantastic to talk to you. Really interesting stuff. Thanks for taking the time. It's been great.
Thanks, Jordan. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Mike, for joining me. An incredible conversation. And I feel like there is so much stuff that I'm going to go away and think about when it comes to my own work and the way that I look at and play games. Really interesting stuff. If you would like to support Mike and find out more about his work, you can check out his YouTube channel, Planet Smasher Games, and his website. I will link them both in the description below. You will also find in the description a link to my Patreon where you can support my work documenting tabletop gaming and the history of Games Workshop and interviewing the people who have brought gaming to life. I really appreciate any support that you can offer. It is hugely important. And don't forget that you can listen to my interviews as a podcast. Just search for In Conversation with Jordan Sorcery wherever you get your pods, and you should find it. Thank you once again to Mike. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.